All right, we'll just go with it. All right. So obviously, sort of the outline of what we'll do. I want to sort of set our understanding of like our interaction with the environment, um, what it was like before the fall, what it was like after, um, and then from there we'll sort of look at what our healthy interaction is with it now, um, and then um, and then we'll look at a couple of issues and just sort of talk about those. Um, there's nothing working on my end, so hold on. Okay. All right, so naturally we'll start at the beginning. Um, so most of what we'll be drawing from, you guys know about the, which we haven't really used a whole lot this semester, is the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. It's sort of like a catechism for the social doctrine of the church. Um, we haven't really used it a whole lot this semester, but I did draw a lot from here because I thought it had a good summary of the church's teaching related to the environment. So we'll be using it a lot. So the first quote, nature, the work of God's creative action, is not a dangerous adversary. It is God who made all things, and with regard to each created reality, God saw that it was good. At the summit of this creation, which was very good, God placed man. Only man and woman among all creatures were made by God in his own image. The Lord entrusted all of his creation to their responsibility, charging them to care for its harmony and development. This special bond with God explains the privileged position of the first human couple in the order of creation. Right, so what I want to sort of focus on initially is a couple things. So we talked about this when we talked about, I think when we talked about either theology of the body, I don't remember other times we've talked about the creation, about how creation wasn't necessarily finished. So when God rests on the seventh day, he sort of turns it over to man to finish creation and to bring it to its fulfillment. And that is sort of Adam's task, right? We talked about how Adam was given the command to till the garden, to guard and till the garden, and obviously the guard has to do with the enemy that was lurking, and the till was to help to bring created order to its perfection. Right, so what I want to pick up on is the combination of it was good and it was very good. All right, so it was good. It is good. Is essentially a way of looking at things philosophically to say that a thing. So what's a good chair, for example, right? A good chair is one that sort of fits the nature of being a chair, right? A good chair is a perfect chair, right? So it has all the things that a chair needs. So when God looks at things and says it is good, he's essentially saying that each of one of these things has everything that they need and everything that belongs to their nature. Okay. And you'll notice if you read carefully, if you read the beginning, there's two places where he creates something and then doesn't say it was good. The first is when he makes the sky, right? And he says, after he creates the sky, he doesn't say it is good because the earth wasn't created yet, right? So the sky wasn't able to fulfill its purpose. It didn't have its sort of complementary thing. And so it was only good when God separated the waters from above and below. All right. And so just this idea of creation being good in this sense just means that that each one of the things that God made has a nature. And this we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. And that nature is in a certain sense complete. And so that if it has a nature, it has an order towards something. All right. The other part that's really important is that that in the beginning, the garden that God creates for man has everything that Adam needs. Okay, everything that Adam needs to meet his own sort of fulfill his own nature. And there's this perfect harmony between Adam and Eve, and God, and then between man and woman and the rest of visible creation. Okay, so we sort of have a little hard time sort of grasping this a little initially, but we can see traces of it even now, right? Where Have you ever really thought about why is it that that we're able to domesticate animals, right? And so St. Thomas would say, okay, the reason why we can domesticate animals is because at some point there was this harmony between us and the animals, such that man was lord over all the animals, right? And that's the notion of Adam, um, Adam giving them names, right? So he knows them, and he's also their master. Um, and there's also, which we'll get into in just a little bit, um, there's also this ordering between man and nature, in that man doesn't eat the animals, right? He doesn't use them for clothing, and he doesn't eat them. So in the beginning, man was a vegetarian. Um, but the point is, of the beginning at least, is not meant to be sort of this scientific account of creation, but a religious account, so that when we get to the fall, we sort of understand that God gave Adam everything he needed. So it wasn't as if Adam was in this life and death struggle, for survival, and that his hand was sort of forced. So it's the idea is to sort of absolve God from any sort of like egging Adam and Eve on, or causing them to fall. They had everything they need, right? And what will be important when we begin to talk about the environment is the fact that there was really only one thing that they couldn't do, right? There was only one tree they couldn't eat from, and that's, in a certain sense, it's symbolic in the sense that it shows that man has a limitation, right? He isn't God; he can't have everything, and so God puts this limitation in there, and essentially tells man not to go beyond his limit, right? And then we can see, if we trace sort of throughout history, right? If you get to like the Tower of Babel, right, where man continually tries to sort of usurp God, and take the place of God, and as Pope Benedict, I think, he said that, man made an image and likeness of God, tried to image God in the wrong way, so he tried to be like God in the wrong way, and that's ultimately why he falls, right? And so we get to the fall, right, and we sort of begin again with Noah. And so again, what the compendium says is, following the destruction wrought by the flood, God's covenant with Noah, and in him with all of humanity, shows that God wants to maintain for the human community the blessing of fertility, the task of subduing creation, and the absolute dignity and inviolability of human life that had characterized the first creation. This is God's desire, despite the fact that with sin, the decadence of violence and injustice, which was punished by the flood, had entered creation. All right, so what are they talking about? All right, so what it's really sort of getting at here, is that as sort of the fall happens, and then wickedness increases, and then God decides, well, that's it, I'm going to blot out mankind, and he does that, sparing only Noah and his family. But now God not only makes a covenant with Noah, but he makes a covenant with all of creation, and he says he's never going to destroy them again by a flood. But again, he sort of reconfirms man as master of the earth, even though he, in his fallen state, he's lost, that sort of absolute dominion over the earth. But now it's in this sort of less than ideal setting. All right, and that's sort of where we find ourselves now. All right, so that's sort of where we are with where we are now, where man is in his relationship with creation. There's this sort of conflict, where that wasn't so in the beginning. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, I think this will sort of highlight what's going on. Okay, so and I picked vegetarianism as a way to sort of compare and contrast man's relationship with the environment before the fall and man's relationship with the environment after the fall. Okay, so in the beginning, in the original innocence, man was a vegetarian. Okay, so he doesn't eat any of the animals. He doesn't use them for clothes. The animals are all domesticated. They obey man. And so what happens is, St. Thomas says that for his own disobedience, man was now punished by the disobedience of the creatures that should have obeyed him. All right. And they become difficult, although not impossible to domesticate, as we sort of saw. and they often pose threat to our lives. And then shortly thereafter, we find that the animals are used for clothing, which is when God makes clothes for the man and the woman, and then later on for food. All right. All right. So why did God do that? Why did that have to change?
It's some of the initial its ability of, like, you said in the garden, man had everything he needed right from the start. Obviously, he's been expelled out of the garden, or was going to be shortly thereafter once God gave him clothes. So is that, I guess, provision that's the fact that not only naturally might have everything around you need, but then also clothed in grace that's no longer there, that they needed to draw on other natural things to maintain the material part of their body, or the material body rather.
Yeah. So, but what changed? Why do they need? Why do they suddenly need the animals in order to survive? So why do they need them for warmth and nutrition where they didn't need them before? I think that's more to the point of the question. So what was God doing? Like, what's his plan here? Okay, so let's go bigger picture then. Why does God allow us to have concupiscence? Or why is that an effect of the fall?
Is it because it shows, it provides like an opportunity to love better, because you have to like overcome this like natural thing working against that love? So you kind of have to love God more in order to do the right thing?
So, well, not necessarily. I mean, you could imagine that let's just say, okay, so they lose grace, and nothing really changes around them. Right? What what does that mean?
So you're saying it's a physical sign of the spiritual reality of their, fall from union with God?
Yes. Right. So he leaves all these reminders. Like, think about the fall, right? What's the first words out of God's mouth, right? He's like, okay, he essentially sort of curses man and woman, giving them labor, right? Like, the woman's going to suffer labor pains, and the man's going to suffer labor pains working, right? But his point in doing that is to let us know something's not right. Like, we're not in right relationship with God. And everything flows from that, right? And this is the important part, right? So if we're not in right relationship with God, we're not in right relationship with other people, no matter how hard we try, because it's sort of baked in, right? And if we're not in right relationship with other people, we're never going to be in right relationship with the environment. Okay. And so he left those signs to remind us of that, right? Like, he could have left us just to ourselves, and we might not even ever realize that there's something wrong, that we're not complete and not whole, right? And so it's like St. Augustine says, like, God gives us the law for us to understand that we can't uphold it, right? And so we cry out, right? And so he leaves all these little sort of thorns and thistles and all these little sort of things, but in his divine providence, in his wisdom, there's still enough goodness present that it still reflects him, and it still reflects his nature, right? He still provides. And so that dependence on, the animals for warmth and for food helps us to understand that we're still limited, right? And in fact, we're so limited, we have to depend on these animals in order to survive, where that wasn't his plan from the beginning. The plan from the beginning was for us to simply just depend on him, right? And so now, because Adam didn't accept his limitation, God gave him more limitations so that he would respect his limitations, so that he would turn to God. Okay. So remember, everything is about God's fatherhood, right? It's always about God showing us his fatherhood. And so it's always to reveal that the truth that God is our father. And so this idea then that man and woman now need to eat meat in order to survive begins to sort of, it sits with us and we're like, oh wow, like I can't just I can't make it without animals. All right, so that being said, all right, this is the other part too. I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I think we brought up sort of the idea of fasting. Why do we fast from meat as Catholics? Has anyone ever thought about that? Why meat? Why do they pick meat? Is it just, because everybody likes a good steak? What's the purpose? What's the purpose of picking meat?
It signifies like the flesh of Christ and us, because we're also meat.
Yeah, well, that's what it points to exactly. So it does point towards that. It points towards. So why even after God allows meat, does he say you can't have animals with blood in it? Because there's only one thing we're supposed to eat with blood in it, right? Like it's a point ahead to the body and blood of Christ, right? So certainly that part of it. But remember, even the eating of meat is like a concession on God's part, right? And so someone who abstains from meat says, I'm giving up this necessary thing for the one thing that's necessary. I'm giving this up because I am now living in the Messianic age, right? Like, so it points ahead. So now it's pointing ahead instead of in the case of, where the eating of it sort of pointed down, this is pointing up. And so this is meant to be, we abstain from meat because it's a sign of Christ's redemptive act, right? And that's why the church picks meat specifically. It has everything to do with that concession he gives to Noah about now you can eat flesh of the animals. Because in a certain sense, we don't need that anymore because we have Christ, even though we still experience the weakness in the flesh. Okay.
Does this relate to like in marriage? There's I don't know, like in marriage, you like with your spouse, you want to be able to be there's like certain things that like you kind of it's like the fall, you kind of act as if like you weren't fallen anymore with like that person or something. It's like kind of the same thing with meat. Like you're kind of going back to like the way that Adam and Eve lived in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's exactly, we're in that intermediate stage of it's already, like Pope Benedict calls it, like the already but the not yet, where we're living. This is why like the celibate priesthood is a better example of it, even though what you're saying, Kevin, from a sacramental sense makes perfect sense. How Christ came and institutes the sacrament of marriage to restore his original plan for marriage between Adam and Eve. And right, so the better sign would be like celibacy, where it points ahead to our sort of eternal destination, right? Yes, this is one of those things that points ahead, right? Because in the eschaton we won't need meat anymore, right? And so Christ came even to redeem that, and we're not quite there yet, but it's sort of baked into. It's a promise that's baked in.
So I guess I'm wondering, like with that, like, so the Friday penance, like I guess our bishops said like you can do something else, and I think their intent was that you could do something that was more of a sacrifice. So like, how do we weigh that with like, like it seems like somehow better to like give up meat or something. I don't know.
Yeah, does everyone sort of know what Kevin's talking about? So for like kind of like for a long time, I don't know exactly how long it was, but on Fridays, so we have an obligation on Fridays to do penance, because it's the day of penance, the day that Christ died. And so for the longest time, that obligation was simply fulfilled by not eating meat. Or in the 1960s, the church removed that particular thing, even though the obligation to to do penance still remain, and left it up to the individual to decide what kind of penance they're going to do. So now, Kevin, so what was your question?
Yeah, so like
in my explanation, I lost your question. So
yeah, I think the reason for doing it was that like they thought that the faithful could find something that was a better sacrifice. I don't imagine like a vegetarian, doesn't eat meat ever. So like, what's the, you know what I mean? Like they could give up something else, like, but like, how do we weigh that with like doing the kind of standard give up meat? Because it sounds like it has kind of like a special meaning, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it does. So the problem, of course, when you say like you can do your own thing, is the majority of people don't do anything, right? Like that's just the way it goes. So that there was a sort of danger in that anyway, and picking that also loses the symbolism, right? So I mean, I think I think as long as you're sort of keeping the obligation to do penance on Fridays, then at this point you're free to choose whatever. But I think the not eating meat thing is, I mean, is easy in the sense of like you don't have to be creative. It doesn't necessarily mean
Yeah.
easy otherwise. But just, and then if it were if they were making the rule based upon like exceptions like vegetarianism, it's always not a good idea to make rules based on that. I think it was more just the purpose was to give some freedom there in choosing what you would give up. The sort of I mean, the majority of people now, though, giving up meat was not that big of a sacrifice, right? Because then they'll just go have a fillet of fish sandwich or something. So that part of it, maybe there is some logic to it. But the point is that to make sure that what happens is the meaning then gets lost of what the symbolism of it. And I would say that most people don't even know the symbolism. I mean, I could be wrong, but I would say that most people were pretty biblically illiterate and probably wouldn't recognize the connection.
Yeah, first I've heard of it.
Yeah, and it puts me like when everything. This is the beauty of being Catholic, right? Like everything is charged with meaning. Like nothing is just like, all right, we should do penance. What can we give up? What if we give up? How about meat? Meat sounds good, right?
So not only have I not heard it before, but this is something that I've almost regularly looked up and sought information on because it's such a common question of why do we give up meat, and it's never an answer I've seen. So I think that's
well, good.
I
was really creative, Casey. Isn't that great?
Rob.
Yes.
Is there any credibility at all to the idea that it's because the Vatican's owned all the fish markets, or is that completely made up?
Well, I've never heard that. So,
you've never heard that before?
No.
I've definitely heard that people say the Vatican just owned all the fish markets, and so they just wanted people to buy fish instead of meat.
That's probably a reach, right? So the Vatican literally owned all the fish markets throughout the world.
That's the perhaps oversimplification that most people would express, is that the way it's phrased is the Vatican owned all the fish markets.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue like when people are that suspicious, right? Like that has a serious like smell of like conspiracy theory. like there's this evil group in the Vatican sitting around going, how can we separate more money from people? I got it. Let's buy up all the fish markets, and then once we've purchased those, we'll make it so they have to eat fish on Fridays. It just kind of seems like a reach, right?
Would you say it smells fishy?
No, I wouldn't say that, because then, I wouldn't say that, because I'll let you say it, Laura, and everyone can groan on mute at you instead of me. All right, so that's why, again, having the meat is sort of charged with meaning, right? And I guess it also gives us at least one of the sort of arguments about, man was originally a vegetarian, while true, isn't an argument necessarily for being a vegetarian. All right, because the weakness is still there. So it almost has this like, vision of utopia where we're not in this, in this state of being, redeemed but not restored, already not yet. Okay. All right. So that's the logic, at least, of the abstaining from meat. Okay. All right. So now we can sort of dive in a little bit about disorder in creation, and then how we are to act within that disorder. All right. So there is a little bit of a controversy about this question about whether when mankind sinned, did disorder enter into creation itself, or did man's relationship just be disordered? So in other words, were there things like like earthquakes or hurricanes, or and then they just didn't have any effect on man, so he was sort of invincible against them, or were there things like forest fire, so forth, or was that already there? John Paul II seems to sort of suggest that our sin caused disorder itself in creation. And when he says, when man turns his back on the Creator's plan, he provokes a disorder which has inevitable repercussions on the rest of the created order. If man is not at peace with God, then earth itself cannot be at peace. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish. He's quoting Hosea. And also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Right. So he's essentially coming down on the side that the disorder of creation has to do with, sort of as an effect of man's fall, but it's inherent to creation as it is. And that sort of jives with what St. Paul says in Romans when he says, for creation awaits with eager expectation the revelation of the children of God. For creation was made subject to futility, not of its own accord, but because of the one who subjected it, in hope that creation itself would be set free from slavery to corruption and share in the glorious freedom of the children of God. All right. So to be clear, though, the natures of the animals themselves didn't fall. Wasn't sort of altered by man's sin. So in other words, like a lion it naturally eats a lamb, and he wouldn't, in Eden, he wouldn't have eaten grass or something. And that's one of those things where sort of understanding what Scripture's getting at, like in the Messianic age, the lion will, lie down with the lamb and eat straw like the ox, as Isaiah says. But we're not there yet. And Eden wasn't it either. Even though it was an earthly paradise, it was still earthly. And so this disorder, our sin introduces the disorder. And why does this matter? Whether the question is, because it gets at the heart of, if our sin introduced the disorder, then our sins now can increase the disorder. Okay. If creation isn't fundamentally disordered in some way, or not fundamentally, but isn't sort of accidentally disordered, then we can it would seem that we could have very little effect on it. Okay. All right. So a little language sort of thing. What does it mean when we talk about treating animals humanely? All right. If you read sort of throughout, the Old Testament, especially, there's this sort of, and we're going to talk about it in a second, this sort of inherent respect for creation, where God sort of builds in all of this in his plan for creation, all of these ways in which creation is to be respected. So let's talk a little bit about how we're supposed to act, at least towards animals, all right? And now St. Thomas talks a little bit about this and why it is. So he says, now all animals are naturally subject to man, okay? This can be proved in 3 ways. First, from the order observed by nature, for just as in the generation of things we perceive a certain order of procession of the perfect from the imperfect, so also is there an order in the use of natural things. Thus the imperfect are for the use of the perfect, as the plants make use of the earth for their nourishment, and animals make use of plants, and man makes use of both plants and animals. Okay, so again, he's talking about sort of the hierarchy of creation, and how man being at the top of the hierarchy is able to use all of the things, right? And of course, with free will and the power to use comes also the possibility of abusing it, right? Of abusing it. And so that's sort of what he's getting at. Okay, so therefore it is in keeping with the order of nature that man should be master over animals, right? And we'll talk about what that mastership should look like. Secondly, this is proved by the order of divine providence, which always governs inferior things by the superior. Wherefore, as man being made to the image of God is above animals, and these are rightly subject to his government. All right, so Revelation sort of supports the idea that God grants dominion to mankind because man is made in the image and likeness of God, right? And so being the highest of the visible creatures, he sort of has dominion over all things, okay? But this dominion is sort of like a two-edged sword, right? So we certainly have the capacity to use things, but that those sort of creatures have their own natures, right? And ways in which they're supposed to be used or not to be used, right? So, a chair has a nature, right? And when I sit on the chair, I'm using it correctly, right? But when I use it to break in someone's house by smashing it through a window, then I'm using it against its nature, right? So this idea that, just because I'm sort of master, I can use anything I want in any way that I want, doesn't fit with the order of creation. It doesn't fit with what dominion actually means, right? So the question really isn't, whether man has dominion over the animals, but what is the proper use of them, okay? And that's where this sort of term of humane treatment comes in, okay? And people, we've all heard it where people take it to extremes and talk about animal rights. Animals don't have any rights, but what animals do have is a certain inherent value to them, such that we should treat them in a certain way, okay? And so when we're talking about humane treatment of animals, what it really means is we treat them as if we're human. So we use them in the right way. And so there's a truly moral way of treating animals as living sentient beings. And so then this idea is that we're not sort of lording over them, but we're stewards of them, right? And so sort of all traces of cruelty or causing unnecessary pain, all of those things carry moral weight to them. And we should avoid these, obviously.
And Rob,
yes.
When we say no rights, that also comes to the fact that we'd say rights carry with them duties, and animals, not being rational creatures, can't have duties.
Right. Yeah. So very good, Connor. So all semester we have been talking about this, right? We've been talking about every time we bring up the word right, we should think responsibility. Okay, if someone has a responsibility to something, they have a right to that thing, right? A responsibility for something. And so since animals don't have free will, they have no responsibilities, right? And so if they have no responsibilities, they have no rights. So exactly.
What about animal testing?
So there's nothing inherently wrong with animal testing. Obviously, again, it needs to be carried out in a sort of a humane fashion. So we can use them even if it causes their death. And if it's because in a certain sense, right? What were they made for? What were animals made for?
To serve man.
Yeah, they were made for the glory of God and to serve man, right? And in serving man, if their death is necessary in order to serve man, serve him in the sense of that it's something that genuinely leads to human thriving, then there's nothing morally wrong with killing animals or testing them or whatever. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah. It's just a question I had. It's kind of, there's a lot of strong opinion in the world about that. So
yeah, and some of that stems from just the fact that people like are cruel, right? Like there's a certain cruelty to it, but it and it's normally sort of generated by sort of a misguided compassion, because they sort of they anthropomorphize the animal in some way and sort of think, well, how would you like it? Usually it's like, how would you like if that happened to you, right? And C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain, he talks a lot about this actually. And I mean, in short, what he says is, yeah, animals, you have to frame the question correctly, because animals, while they feel pain, they don't suffer, right? Only man is capable of suffering because he's a rational animal, right? And so he sort of talks about how, again, you don't want to necessarily cause animal, pain unnecessarily, but pain is not the same thing as suffering, right?
Can you distinguish the two?
Yeah. So pain would just be it's hard for us to distinguish because they're almost always equated in us in some way. Pain would be kind of, you put your hand on a hot stove. Ouch! I took my hand off. Right. That's the animal, because animals don't live. They have no anticipation of further pain or further suffering. Right. They're simply, that hurts. Pull away from it. That's it. Right. And they may not be able to pull away from it, and so the pain continues. Whereas suffering always has sort of this spiritual component to it, where you can experience pain without suffering, right? But you can't experience suffering without pain. And so suffering is the sort of spiritual component of, it's like a spiritual version of bodily pain, and they can be related, but they don't necessarily have to be. Does that make sense?
So I guess, would you say that it's, are you using spiritual light in the strict sense of saying, okay, well, we have a soul that has certain powers of it that is able to do things that animals just can't do, and the suffering lies in those things? Or are you using it more in a sense of saying it's like are you using it in a different way?
No, I'm using it in that sense, that it's something that's felt in in the spiritual in our spiritual faculties, not in our bodily faculties.
How does like animals mourning their dead like factor into this distinction?
Have you seen an animal mourn their dead?
I mean, it's not the same, but they
dogs get sad, or like they appear sad. I don't know.
Yeah, I think animals will they can remember.
They'll go back to the same place where someone was when they died, or something like that. Like I've heard of stories like that.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, why do they do that? Is it because they're walking around trying to find meaning in life, or is it because they go there because they want to see, like, they want the pleasure of seeing that person or that other creature?
Yeah.
I would imagine it's not, my life is meaningless, I'm going to go to their grave and sit there and reminisce about them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I don't know that I've ever seen that, but I mean, I don't doubt that, there's some, closely related things animals do that seem very human initially. That's, again, why people respond the way they do about how animals are treated, but I don't think it's the same thing. I think if you start seeing like doggy funerals, or like them burying their dead or something, that would be, that would probably trigger something. Okay. All right. So that's sort of where we are with the animals.
Rob,
Yes.
my question is about CAFOs, which are just like giant barns for growing livestock.
Mm-hmm.
And like, would it go against the nature of the animals to like feed them, like for chickens? Like, would it go against the nature of chickens to feed them so much that they can't move because their chest muscles are so big, and to put them in cages so they can't walk?
Yes. Yeah. So there is definitely a moral component. Again, you have to like this sort of like, even, I mean, you could even do it like in these massive farms too, but like the way that animals are treated, there certainly is a moral component to it, because and you sort of nailed it when you said, is it sort of contrary to their nature.
Do we have a moral obligation to buy cage-free chicken?
I don't think so. Like I certainly think that you know, because you get in the principle of cooperation, right? Like how much are you actually cooperating by? I think given the choice between the two, you should always choose those that treat the animals more humanely, right? And again, humanely being respecting their natures. And I don't necessarily think the issue is necessarily that the chicken are in cages. I think that it's that, you know, they can't really move around, right? So they certainly putting them in cages in the sense of like giving them an area to roam or range that's fenced in wouldn't be the same thing. But to Elizabeth's point about, you know, when you're pumping them full of steroids and you know, overfeeding them, that probably goes above and beyond like sort of how we're supposed to treat animals. So to answer your question, Casey, I would say that if at all possible, yes, you should definitely treat them. You know, you should definitely buy from companies that don't do that, right? Okay. Any other questions about that? And you know, too, like that again, like I guess this is sort of anticipating what we're going to talk about, but you can immediately see, like, okay, so we're talking about animals, we're talking about moral treatment. You can immediately see how the question of the environment and the question of animals is inherently a moral question. And that's what I want to sort of tie together for the rest of the time we talk. All right. But, you know, even like, again, you know, the idea that the man's just not supposed to run roughshod over creation. And you think about, it's not accidental that, like, you read the Old Testament and there's all these laws about how animals are supposed to be treated, right? And it's not because God loves the animals, but it's because when you abuse them, they lose their utility, but they also lose like the reason that God made them, in the sense that they become this sort of product, like the overfed chicken. I'm going to keep going back to that, right? That's really a product of man and not something that came from God, right? So man, you sort of usurps it from God, and then in doing that, like what God planned to reveal of himself through the chicken can no longer be seen, right? And so it's that idea of sin sort of spreading out, right? So sin blurs the image of God in man, and again, in an analogous way, not in the same way, our sins like gluttony, greed, can blur the image of God in creation, right? So he gives us all of creation because it's supposed to reveal him to us, right? Not that the chickens are on the same level as us, but the point is that that a chicken was made, yes, for our service, but first and foremost to somehow reveal something about God, right? And so throughout the Old Testament, you know, God has sort of these rules about, you know, how to treat the ox and the donkey, you know, how to treat fields, and all of that is not just to protect creation, but it's to protect man from becoming greedy, and, you know, trying to sort of become this absolute slave master over creation. Okay, and I think one of the sort of telling passages is in Deuteronomy in chapter 20, when God essentially says, when you're at war with the city and have to lay siege to it for a long time before you capture it, you can't destroy the trees by putting an axe to them. You can eat of them, but you can't cut them down. And he's like, why should the trees be included in your siege? And he said, the ones without fruit on them, so that ones that don't have any other utility for man other than just being trees, well, those you can cut down if you need siege works, but only while you need them. So don't do it indiscriminately. And so that I think captures this balance between you know, being a steward and using it versus when you abuse it, right? All right, so with all this sort of as the foundation, let's see if we can sort of talk about a Catholic view of the environment. Again, returning back to the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, it says, man then must never forget that his capacity to transform and in a certain sense create the world through his own work is always based on God's prior and original gift of the things that are. All right, so we can never forget that ultimately creation is meant to be a temple in which we worship God, right? And so there's all these reminders of him all around, right? And I think we've talked about before about, why are there all these images and beautiful churches of like gardens, and it's to remind us of Eden, which is to remind us that God made the earth to be his temple, right? So he wanted to walk in the garden with mankind, and everything there. His images like a temple. There'd be all these images of him, right? And so he wants us to remember that it's first and foremost a gift. He must not make arbitrary use of the earth. Okay, so back to what we said, subjecting it without restraint to his will, as though it did not have its own requisites and prior given purpose, right? So each thing has its own nature, its own purpose, and we can only use those things in accord with that nature or purpose. When he acts in this way, instead of carrying out his role as co-operator with God in the work of creation, man sets himself up in place of God and then ends up provoking rebellion on the part of nature, which is more tyrannized than governed by him. If man intervenes in nature without abusing it or damaging it, we can say that he intervenes not in order to modify nature, but to foster its development in its own life, that of the creation that God intended. All right, so man isn't supposed to just sort of step back, have nothing to do with it, and create these sanctuaries, but he's supposed to use it in the manner that God had originally planned. Okay, that's the sort of the Catholic view of the environment. All right, so we're gonna take a little detour and talk a little bit about how the world is different from even 300 or 400 years ago. So the Companion again warns, nature appears as an instrument in the hands of man, a reality they must constantly manipulate, especially by means of technology. A reductionistic conception quickly spread. This reductionistic conception views the natural world in mechanistic terms and sees development in terms of consumerism. Primacy is given to doing and having rather than to being, and this causes serious forms of human alienation. Such attitudes do not arise from scientific and technological research, but from scientism and technocratic ideologies that tend to condition such research. With the progress of science and technology, questions as to their meaning increase and give rise to an ever greater need to respect the transcendent dimension of the human person and creation itself. So Francis Bacon was a philosopher in the 17th century, and what he ultimately set out to do was to conquer nature. All right, and so up to that point, man understood that he was part of nature, and he too had a nature that also couldn't be altered, and that all of nature, again, in the proper order, revealed God, but each thing had its own purpose, and so you could only use things according to those purpose, right? And out of that mindset that each thing had order and purpose comes a sort of scientific mentality of beginning to study things, right? And why do you study things? Let's see how much, like, it's because you study them to understand them, right? So man sets out to study the order. Well, by the 17th century, Francis Bacon says, no, we study them in order to manipulate them so that we can use them for our own good, right? And so now comes this idea of sort of man using power to manipulate nature. And this sort of understanding, so on the one side, there's this idea that nature is this wisely and beautifully made sort of integral whole. And then Francis Bacon comes along and starts sort of setting us down the road where it's something to be conquered and something that sort of is our enemy. And so we must absolutely and totally subdue it. And this idea is pretty much how most of modernity would look at even science, right? The purpose of science is not necessarily to study the thing, but it's to study the thing so that we can manipulate it in some way, right? And that mindset is obviously easy to fall into, but we have to sort of understand that that it's really just a power play, and and this can cause huge problems for us even now, because especially with technology, you know, when your whole goal is to manipulate something, then wisdom sort of goes out the window, right? Like, where do you stop? Like, what is enough? All right, and so this is sort of at the heart of if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. He's sort of getting at this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about technology, and again, not sort of as a Luddite, but for us to sort of understand what technology should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for, right? So when is technology good? Let's ask that question first. What makes technology good?
It enables the expression of the God-given gifts that man has in order to, I guess if we kind of take that principle you were building on at the start, where you said God gave man a mission to I think it was till the ground, or you said kind of to build upon creation.
Mm-hmm.
Technology being, I guess, a manifestation of that is our building upon creation, and so it can be good, and so that expresses, I guess, some capacity for creation that God has given to us.
All right. So yes, but let's see if we can dig a little deeper. So let's say I develop this new this technological tool, okay, and it makes let's just say it makes farming easier. So it's like a Roomba that goes and clears the fields, right? I don't have to do anything. Is that a good technology or a bad technology?
It could be both. It can turn into bad technology if it leads to the overuse of the land and like the exploitation of that land, so that it like no longer serves its purpose.
Okay, so that would certainly be part of it.
But you also, the way you worded that was interesting. So you say it's such that you don't have to do anything. Are you then doing nothing because man was not made to sit around all day? Like
yeah.
working.
So well, so okay. Now let's get at the question: why do we work?
Well, I mean, like work is sanctified. Like work is a good thing in its proper place.
Why is it a good thing?
Builds virtue.
God did it.
Who said that? You didn't pop up. Who said it builds virtue?
Honor.
Yeah, so it perfects us, right? Like work is a good thing because it perfects us. All right, it doesn't just perfect the thing it's working on. In fact, it may or may not perfect the thing that's being worked on. It perfects the worker first and foremost. All right, and so if I look at a technology, I have to then go, okay, does this technology perfect me or not? Right? So the answer to the question is, what's a good technology? What's a bad technology? The good technology is the one that helps a man grow in virtue. The bad technology is one that doesn't. All right. And so our farming Roomba, the question then becomes, okay, how does this make? And I deliberately loaded the question like Casey said. I said, you don't have to do anything. Well, is that good? Is ease, is doing and having better than being? Is ease and comfort better than work? Not necessarily, right? And so we don't ever evaluate technology in those things. We always evaluate in terms of efficiency, all right? And so we have to get in the habit of going, okay, does this technology actually make me more human, right? And C.S. Lewis, I think, it might be Mere Christianity. I'm not sure. He uses a calculator as an example. He's like, well, on the one hand, you think, well, calculator is a great thing, right? But on the other hand, how much math skill is lost because of calculators, right? So are we more or less human because of calculators? And I know there's all these like great, calculators that can do a lot of stuff that otherwise would be really hard to do. I get all that. But the question is whether it actually serves man or makes him something less than he was before. All right, and that's how we have to evaluate technology. Okay.
Within technology, like, you still have to have the ability to learn how to use it and to what to do with that knowledge or that resource attained from utilizing that technology. So there's not a total neglect of work when using technology, I would say.
No, I mean, I'm painting with a really, like, Lizzie, you're exactly right. Like, I'm painting with a broad brush, obviously, like, to kind
I
of,
think the calculator is a perfect example in that, because I've now learned the rote mechanisms that I need to press this button to get that answer, but I've not actually learned, something real or even something logical. It's just a series of, like, I could teach a monkey to press a certain number of buttons in a certain order. So the knowledge itself is less valuable.
I would say I like the calculator example a lot because math was kind of my thing in school, and there were a lot of people who got they were mad that I seemed to like get math better than them, but I think part of that was that I saw that like using a calculator was a big disincentive for people to learn things. But it wasn't like it was something you could never use. It was just the teachers that I had that they were like, you can use the calculator after we've learned this, but like you still have to go through the process of learning the skill first. Like there are certain problems that are just impractical to do without a calculator. So like, sure, it can be useful, but they still had an emphasis on teaching the mechanism. And I noticed that the kids who took the time to learn had a better grasp later on in the year and could solve the more complicated things more easily because they didn't lean on the technology necessarily.
Yeah, so I think the internet is another example, right? So people don't memorize things anymore, right? Because I can just go look it up. And is that more human or less human, right? So it's less human, right? And so there's value in both. And so to Lizzie's point, like you have to know how to look things up. You have to read them and all that. And that is all a good thing, but the manner in which we use it absolutely matters. All right.
One of my favorite things Connor says whenever we're talking about Aquinas, that he did this all before he could just go onto the internet and search up. Like I know there's that verse somewhere. It's just he knew it all so well. Whereas all of us are like, oh yeah, I know like 3 words, in the thing I'm trying to figure out. Like let's it's
Yeah, I mean, his power of memory obviously was maybe even divinely given, but still, I think that's how we have to sort of take technology and critically evaluate it. And I think the criteria we use is, does this make me more or less of what what God made me to be? All right, so sorry, I got off on a little tangent there. So
I have a quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say so would you say that technology or maybe even like just good technology is only necessary because of the fall? Like would Adam and Eve been able to create technology, instruments, whatever, to better harvest crops or feed themselves in that way, or is it only because we have this fallen nature, similar like how like we have animals for that reason now?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would have. They certainly would have used tools, and and there's nothing inherently in that they would say, okay, well, I've got to do all this by hand, but the tools would be wisely used. I think is the difference of the way they were used versus necessarily whether they were used or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let me see if I can get back on track and remember where I was going with this. Sorry, I got off on my little technology diatribe for the wise. So this is C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man. So what C.S. Lewis is doing here is, and he says it in the beginning of the book, he's sort of taking that idea that man is supposed to sort of dominate nature, the sort of Baconian way of looking at things, and he's trying to sort of get us to understand the consequences of it. We're beginning to see the consequences of it, is what he's sort of getting at. So it's a short book, definitely worth reading. but I think the thesis of the book is sort of summarized by this quote. It says, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue." Right. So what he's saying, in the past, we would look at reality and we'd go, okay, how can I conform myself to reality as it really is? All right. And you'd say, okay, well, the answer to that question is first understand it. Then you got to have some self-discipline and you got to have some virtue. All right. And then he says, well, there were people, they would take magic and try to manipulate reality, right? In the old. So he says, for magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, where we get the word technology from. And so no longer is the solution knowledge, self-discipline, or virtue. The solution now is to come up with some technique, right? So it's no longer perfective of man, it's perfective of the situation or technique. And both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious. All right. So if we don't care about knowledge, self-discipline, or virtue, morality goes out the window, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. All right. So, and here's his point. He says, man's conquest of nature turns out in the moment of its consummation to be nature's conquest of man. So this lowering of man to be less than he was made to be. All right. And that's what he's getting at. He's like, okay, if you're going to subdue nature, you're going to lose. Every victory we seem to win has led us step by step to this conclusion, right? And if you've read Pope Francis's Laudato Si, that is one of the things he talks about. All right. In fact, he has I think he sets out in the beginning, he's like 5 or 6 things. He's like, I'm going to talk about these 5 or 6 things, and one of them is he's going to set out what he calls the critique of new paradigms and forms of power derived from technology. And so he's sort of attempting to teach us, who are now pretty much drunk on power because of all the technological advances we've had, right? I mean, we don't realize how much power technology gives us, right? Just even with a cell phone, the access of all the stuff we have, how much power it has. Unprecedented technological advances in the last 100 years, that if we don't at some point accept our limitations, is going to lead us to destruction, okay? And then his point is that the destruction of the environment, of which is sort of our home and we're the center of, is a sign of this, okay? And so he goes to sort of this great length, not to be seen as this sort of Luddite, but for us to stop sort of thinking that that this increase in power is actually progress, right? Are we becoming more human or less human than our predecessors, right? So progress would be moving us towards something, and the problem is that because of the way technology works now, because it goes so fast, and because we've mastered so many things, our wisdom isn't able to catch up, right? And so we depend upon, and you see this right now, especially with the coronavirus, where everyone is looking for some expert to tell them how to understand what's going on, right? And we do this with a lot of things, right? But the wise man doesn't need experts, does he? Right? And that's because everything has been made so complicated. And so it gets to be the point where it goes, okay, well, it's just whatever's technologically possible is morally permissible, right? Which is another theme of Pope Benedict that he talks a lot about, right? And so, and you see this especially in like bioethics. Someone might say, well, I don't know the difference between embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells. They're both stem cells. What the heck is the difference? I'll leave that for the experts to figure out, right? Where there is a distinct moral difference between the two. And then there's also the sort of, I guess it's like a quaint saying where, well, if we're not supposed to do it, if God gives the knowledge to do it, then it's okay to do it. So we have to get in the habit of asking sort of whether something is moral first and foremost.
Rob,
Yes.
So on this, so I guess you brought up the coronavirus. So medicine kind of with related to technology. Now I think we can say, I would think we can say that something, I guess, big medical advances with organ transplants, eye surgery, things that are definitely, I would think in the nature of like we take eye surgery, like it's in the nature of my eye to be able to see, and therefore I'm improving. I'm simply helping it do its job.
Mm-hmm.
And so we take something, we talk about like self-knowledge and self-discipline, and we think about, okay, a lot of self-discipline and virtue comes just through like suffering, is kind of learning to deal with arduous things. And yet we have a lot of, a lot of medicines, a lot of things like that are trying to remove any of the aridity of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that, I guess, is that another aspect of it, is that we lose the ability to suffer because we're so used to being pampered pampered and everything?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you think about like that's at the heart of like the euthanasia movement, right? Is like suffering is really the only evil in the world now, right? Like that's how it's viewed. And while alleviating suffering is a good thing, you can't do it at any cost, right? So the eye surgery thing is probably a great example, right? So restoring the function of vision back to the eye is a good thing. But then how you do that absolutely matters, right? So you can imagine, maybe I would clone a human being just to take his eyes, because you said that vision is a good thing, right? And so that part of it that moral evaluation doesn't happen any longer. And then we assume that everyone is choosing the right thing to do, if that makes sense. All right. So what I want us to then sort of grasp then is to make sure that we avoid the technological trap, right, of falling into thinking. And again, I think that's one of Pope Francis's things that he's sort of has talked a lot about understanding just how much power we have at our at our fingertips, and then taking that power and using it morally, and not just as a way to sort of steamroll the environment. All right, so we've now sort of moved to what I think we can call a Catholic environmentalism. And this again, returning back to the compendium. A correct understanding of the environment, which hopefully we've sort of set, right, prevents the utilitarian reduction of nature to a mere object to be manipulated and exploited. At the same time, it must not be absolute. It must not absolutize nature and place it above the dignity of the human person. So immediately we're looking at the both end of Catholicism, right, where it's not something we can just steamroll and use however we want, but it's also not something that we should divinize. In the latter case, so far as to divinize nature or the earth, as can readily be seen in certain ecological movements that seek to gain an internationally guaranteed institutional status for their beliefs. So the solution to sort of the abuse is then not to go, off the other extreme and turn it into sort of a quasi-religion. And what is always sort of there's always a danger of turning, it's not necessarily just like earth worship, but it's always the danger of sort of looking at each of the objects individually, so not seeing it as a whole, right? So we'll talk more about this later. Like in Psalm 8, the psalmist says, well, God created with his fingers, right? Not his hands, but his fingers, right? And so that shows a certain amount of like meticulous, like everything sort of fitting together. If you can imagine the image of God sort of tinkering with his fingers and bringing everything together. What has happened though, is that we've lost this vision of the whole. That's what scientism is, I think. I think scientism is this inability to look at the universe as a whole thing, and to see how it all sort of fits together. Instead, we sort of study. I mean, I know scientists who like never actually go and study the thing they're studying. They look at it's like they look at all their stuff is done like in a lab, under like a microscope, and they're looking at like all these molecular effects, and so that what they've sort of picked it apart, right? And this is what, you know, we've talked about this before about looking at things like I call it nothing butness, right? Like, you know, this is nothing but a bunch of, you know, water is nothing but, you know, 2 hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule, right? Nothing but, and not seeing things in the big picture and seeing how they all fit together. And then when we do that, then it makes it really easy to manipulate things, right? When we have this sort of this view that everything is just like in a compartment and sits by itself, and you can see this attitude too when you look at when we talk later about like global warming. Some people's solutions to it, right, they're often short-sighted for the very reason that because they're so used to looking at things on that almost like that microscopic level of things. And so we have to be careful about not about looking at things individually like that. The other part, I think, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, is when we talk about often, it's usually people that are sort of more left-leaning that talk about sort of environmentalism, right? But they're making moral claims on people, but then denying that there's human nature, right? So you can't make moral claims on people while denying that humans have a specific nature and certain things are wrong and certain things are right. And so you can't, that they try to sort of appeal to self-interest, and that doesn't work. And so what Pope Benedict has done, Pope Benedict, by the way, sort of has had the nickname of the Green Pope, because he wrote a ton on the environment. And his message was pretty simple, actually. He dubbed the phrase, he called it human ecology, okay? And this is worth us grasping and spending a few minutes with. And so in one of his interviews, he said, the pollution of the outward environment we are witnessing is only the mirror and the consequence of the inward environment, right? So he's saying that our inward environment is polluted, and so therefore, of course, we see the outward environment being polluted, to which we pay too little heed, all right? So his point is that if you can't talk about pollution in the outward environment if you're unwilling to actually get at the heart of it, which is pollution in the inward environment. I think that this is also a defect of the ecological movements. They crusade with an understandable and also legitimate passion against the pollution of the environment, whereas man's self-pollution of his soul continues to be treated as one of the rights of his freedom, right? So you can't sort of glorify man's freedom and let him do whatever he wants, and normally it's in the sexual realm, while at the same time then saying, well, you are obligated to do this thing, or you ought to recycle, or you ought to do this. So there's this discrepancy here. We want to eliminate the measurable pollution, but we don't consider the pollution of man's soul and his creaturely form. He must acknowledge himself as a creature and realize that there must be a sort of inner purity to his creatureliness, spiritual ecology, if you will. Right. So he looks at this idea of environmental ecology and compares it to moral ecology. Benjamin Weicker, who teaches I think he teaches at Steubenville now. He has a really good book called In Defense of Nature, which is really worth reading. And he has sort of this 4-point thesis that I want to sort of unpack, which is getting at how to move from what he's really trying to get at is, and this is what Pope Benedict is trying to do, is to get from talking about, having to do, XYZ for the environment, to why we actually treated the environment that way to begin with. So is the environmental pollution a symptom of something else that if we don't treat the underlying problem, then it's just going to continue? And of course, Pope Benedict thinks, yes, it's the underlying problem is what's causing it. And so Weicker, in his book, he says, if we can befoul nature by violating its intrinsic order and beauty, can we do the same to human nature, and in particular human sexuality? If intemperance and greed destroy the natural environment, do they also destroy the moral environment and sexuality itself? And so he has these 4 points. which we'll go through. So his first point is there's this order to nature, which you all recognize as good and beautiful, and that we should respect and protect it. But that there's also then an order to human nature that's good and beautiful, and that we should protect. And then he says, okay, well, if we violate the order of the external nature, well, that's pollution, right? And then if we violate the sort of internal nature, then we've polluted our souls. So what his point is that when we stop polluting our souls, so when we grow in virtue, we'll actually stop polluting the environment, okay? If human nature is indeed, as the name suggests, part of nature, then we should be able to call violations of the human nature moral pollution. And for that very same reason, we can claim that we have in some way by our actions damaged human nature. Again, greed actually does something to us, right? So it harms us. Intemperance actually does something to us. It harms us, right? And so only by being virtuous can we actually respect our natures and actually thrive, right? And so what he wants to do is then expand ecology to understand, though, if we get at the heart of the problem, which is the lack of virtue, or what Pope Benedict would call human ecology, then a lot of the environmental issues would go away, right? So a lot of it is driven by the overconsumption. What is that driven by? It's driven by greed or gluttony, and that if we ignore the greed and gluttony and then try to sort of fix the problem, well, the only way that we can fix the problem is by using a hammer coming down with power, right? And in that case, freedom is then lost, right? And so if we have this sort of human ecology where we get back to forming people in the virtues, we'll see that many of the environmental problems will go away. But even if we don't, the point is that we'll never get to any of the environmental issues without first forming a virtuous people, because there's no way you can stop people from fixing the problems just by giving them tax breaks or whatever. And so that's his point. And so what he does is he sort of takes the view on the left, that the sort of the heavy environmentalism, and then the view that tends to be on the right, where we can pretty much do whatever we want, and then tries to unite them by sort of talking about virtue. Okay, and so John Paul II picked up the same sort of idea, and he has this. Yes.
Before we move on to that, so do you think? Do you think it comes for when we think about, I guess, kind of those who would advocate for ecology, or who, like I said, who are normally seen being the ones who want more environmental movements or more action done in the environmental movement? Is it, I guess, in your experience, is a philosophical conviction like, okay, nature is good and has its intrinsic order that we ought to preserve, or is it more of a, I'm not sure if utilitarianism would be the right word, but utilitarianism of, if we don't do this, we're all going to die, and therefore we need to do X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, I think it would probably be more of the utilitarianism, because they tend to deny, at least in practice, like they tend to be moral relativists, right? Which is a little bit odd when they're sort of fighting you and telling you that you ought to do something, and then they're moral relativists. But I think that it's mostly the utilitarian sort of approach where the world's going to end in 10 years. But I remember reading when the fall of during the fall of the Berlin Wall, that a lot of the Marxists, when that collapsed, they all moved to the environmental movement, because it was a way in which to sort of create this conflict between rich and poor. So it has this sort of Marxist tendency to it, where it's where now the battle's just going to be fight here, because we can reframe the environmental question as a battle between rich and poor, and now we're back to Marx's question. And then, well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is socialism or communism, right? And that's why it tends to be that environmentalism and socialism go hand in hand. Even though if you look like historically, you take a communist country like China and look at how horribly they treat the environment. That's how you know it's a philosophical issue versus a true concern for the environment. I think I think it's been hijacked a little bit because it should be in a sense legitimate because there is an environmental crisis. But I forget who it was to say like never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Where if you can manipulate a crisis in order to further your agenda, then you should absolutely do it. And I think so that's part of it. So I hate to answer your question, Connor, I hate to sort of paint with a broad brush because there are people who are legitimately concerned and legitimately want it better, but then there are plenty of people who want to manipulate it and use it to sort of further, especially the sort of Marxist agenda.
So you would say that, like, I guess any philosophical linkage between kind of a let's call it like the kind of integral ecology versus the socialist or more stronger government regulation, I guess, solutions to the environmental problems are more of a forced thing than an actual philosophical link between the two ideas.
Yeah, it has to be forced because if you actually if you start from the premise that the environment nature is good, and that there's such thing as a proper use of nature and improper use of nature. Well, all you have to do is keep tracing down the steps, and you realize, well, okay, man has a special role to play, which then makes man unique, because we don't demand that the polar bears, stop, pooping in certain places or whatever, right? Because of the environmental damage they're doing. But they even sort of recognize that somehow human beings are different and that they have an obligation to take care of the environment. And so I don't know how you could not keep following that train of thought to the point of, oh, this is actually a moral problem and not just a problem of, we're using too much, plastic or something. Does that make sense? So
I mean, I guess it often can get reduced down to kind of the materialistic.
Yeah, the person who is like the honest person, like the person of goodwill, is actually concerned about it. That sort of traces their line of thinking can only come to the same conclusion that the church has already come to about this. That there is a problem, but the problem consists in first, requiring or calling people or forming people to actually not, be so greedy or not so, gluttonous or whatever. But the problem is that, neither one of those things actually are even values in our culture, right? Like most people think, when they think like the environment, they're like, oh, okay, like we just need to be, we just need to find out better ways in which we can still use things as much as we are. It's like the Diet Coke effect, right? Where I really want the taste of Coke, but I don't want the calories. So make me something that'll fix that, right? And so most people's solution to the environmental problem is, well, let's just find a way that we can filter CO2. Let's just shoot a bunch of talc up in the sky that will, cool the Earth's temperature because it'll block the sun. Never getting at the heart of what's causing the problem. And that's the problem with it. Okay, so John Paul II says on his message for world peace in 1990, he says, modern society will find no solution to the ecological problem unless it takes a serious look at its lifestyle. In many parts of the world, society is given to the instant gratification and consumerism while remaining indifferent to the damage which these cause. As I've already stated, the seriousness of the ecological issue lays bare the depth of man's moral crisis. If an appreciation of the value of the human person, of human life is lacking, we will also lose interest in others and in the earth itself, right? So you cannot at the same time, for instance, support abortion and be an environmentalist, right? Because if we don't care about vulnerable people in the womb, why would we care about vulnerable people in Africa who don't have clean water? right? So you can see how they're intertwined with the how the two things are intimately connected, and how environmentalism actually fits into the pro-life movement, right? Like where if you really care about not only people's their temporal life, but their eternal life, you can't help but think, okay, well, this overconsumption is actually harmful for these people, right? It's not just harming the environment, it's harming them. And so this connection between again, this sort of almost schizophrenic connection between, they tend to be, anti-population, and so they're pro-abortion, pro-contraception, which then demeans the value of life, which then demeans any reason for caring what the effects of my stuff do. Why would I, if I don't want children, why would I care what's going to happen in the next generation? And so this again, the approach they take is clearly either just misguided, or usually, again, it's been hijacked. So, if you're going to contend that there's a delicate harmony then in the natural order, then there has to be a delicate sort of harmony in the moral order as well. And so that's sort of what John Paul II is getting at. He's like, okay, before you try to enact all this legislation in which you harm people further, why don't we not be so scared about actually confronting the fact that that our lifestyles are harmful to us, maybe even more harmful to the people who overconsume, to their spiritual well-being than the bodily well-being of the people who suffer from its effects. And so that's sort of where he's getting at. All right. So is this sort of clear now about the connection, the moral connection, ultimately, and how that the solution has to come from that direction?
I have a general practical question, which is just that, like, it makes sense to your first question, but then to the second point, sort of more practical, like, it seems like there are certain forms of overconsumption that you can't help but avoid. Like, there's statistics on, like, carbon footprint stuff, and like just the fact that most of us have to drive to work automatically puts us over that. So, like, just from a practical moral standpoint, how do you make these kinds of decisions? How do you determine, where you should make changes, that kind of stuff? Just like personally, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of so certainly there are, the problem is that that we don't have good data on actually what the effects of some of the stuff we do, right? Like, is there really, is you driving to work, is this carbon footprint idea, is that legitimate, right? Is the level that they're at legitimate? And that, I don't know that question, right? So I would say that, but it makes sense that if I don't need a big SUV, that I don't buy a big SUV, right? That if I can walk or bike or run, I should walk, bike, or run, and not drive. Like, it makes sense morally. Like, it's not just oh, this would be nice for the environment, but again, those things are better for me, right? Like, it's better for me to be temperate in the things I buy, and it's better for me to get out and even physically, but even spiritually, to get out and walk rather than drive. So I think it has to be guided by those types of decisions, where in each thing you go, what's better? What ultimately is better for me? And you'll find that most of the time, when it's better for you in that way, it's also better for the environment, right? And so that's the truth underneath the lie of the way we try to present this as a self-interested question, right? But
Right.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, like, as I was preparing this week, about just the amount of, like, trash, like, we as a family generate. I'm like, wow, this is, like, unbelievable. I'm like, okay, what's going to happen to this trash? It's going to end up in a landfill, and and where's that landfill? Well, that landfill is in some literally poor slob's neighborhood, right? And so what are my obligations there? Well, you could say, okay, well, the obligation is to recycle. Well, but what happens to recycling? Well, most of it ends up in China. And so what I will say is what Lizzie just said. So if a thing can be composted, that's a good thing, right? But what about the other stuff, right? Like recycling, maybe not the answer, right? Because where does all the recycling end up? Most of it ends up in China, and they do, pretty horrible things to the environment while, extracting the things out of the recycling. So there's not a good answer. Like the answer is at this, like we need to redo a lot of the ways we do stuff, and that's but I think that starts with an awareness that we, that okay, this is going to generate a lot of trash. I don't need this thing. Maybe maybe I don't need that. Maybe I don't need separate shipments from Amazon. Maybe they can just all throw it in one box. Because recycling maybe not the answer, totally the answer, right? And then the gas of the coming twice to my house versus once to my house. Like a lot of things you just think about. Okay, what are the implications of this? And I think that if you started with that, and everybody started with that, we'd see that things were vastly different.
Rob?
Yes.
As well, when assessing kind of Casey and I, there was a group of people we were talking about this, and Casey brought up a good point, which was that oftentimes these things, when we're trying to assess the moral implications of it, the evil effect of it is so remote from our action that it almost makes it, you kind of see where I'm going, it makes it difficult to say, okay, how, the proximate good that comes out of it might be, exceed the true like evil effect that's going to come from my action alone. I guess this is this kind of tragedy of commons, is that it's not just about my thing. It's that when I do, even though it's a little part from me, well, it's a little part from 1,000 people, and then suddenly it's a big thing. How does that play into when we're trying to judge these things in their moral effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult if you're looking for I don't want to say like absolution of it, like how close is too close. I think if you're thinking in those terms, it's probably not going to fix the problem. Yeah, you're probably not doing anything wrong per se, because but if you're coming from the other side of it, okay, well, what actually promotes more of the good here, rather than worrying about like, okay, is this wrong versus am I okay here? I think I would start from the which promotes the good more approach, rather than trying to evaluate, whether I'm, whether I'm proximately guilty or just remotely or whatever. Because this is one of those things, because it's so ingrained, it's hard not to get your fingers dirty with it, right? It's hard not to be sucked into it. So I would just say in each decision, try to figure out what, if you can bring good into it, like which is the better thing to do. All right, so last 2 or 3 slides, and we went long, even though I promised I wasn't going to go long. Let's just talk a little bit about population control measures, because very often the West, when they help Africa, likes to attach population control measures to any kind of aid they give. And this is just an awareness thing, sort of understand that this is going on, and to understand things from the African perspective. There's a really good book called Target Africa. I don't know if any of you have ever read it. And it's basically about this lady. Her name is Obianju Ikiocha, I think her name is. I'm probably butchering how you say it. But she writes. She lives in the United States now, and she's from Africa, and she writes this book basically talking about this sort of what she calls neo-colonization that's going on in Africa, and where rather than Western countries coming in and occupying their countries, they're doing it from afar by sort of poisoning their culture. And so it's more of an awareness book and really eye-opening. But the USCCB has already sort of warned about this. Affluent nations such as our own have to acknowledge the impact of voracious consumerism instead of simply calling for population and emissions control from people in poor nations. All right, so very often it's not me that needs to sort of change my behavior. It's the fact that those people in Africa are having too many kids, and their carbon footprint is gigantic. So we need to do something about them. We should promote a respect for nature that encourages policies fostering natural family planning and education rather than coercive population control. So, like I said, very often when Western countries offer aid to countries, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute, it's almost always only to be received based on some population control criteria or measure. The problem is that in Africa they don't want that. All right. The problem is that Africa has become an extremely Catholic continent, so people in the West look at Africa and they're like, wait, the average number of desired children for these women is 6.1. Right. That's how many children they want across the continent. Right. And so they look and they're like, wow, this country, wow, their average is like 5 children per woman. Well, clearly they have an unmet need for contraception, right? No one in their right mind would want that, right? Even though it's not even, most of them don't have as many children as they want. So they think, well, there's this unmet need for contraception, so let's provide it for them. And I think I was reading in that book that Africa receives 70 billion condoms a year from the West. 70 billion. No. It's 2 billion, and it's $70 million worth of condoms. And these countries are obviously desperately in need, right? And so all this Western aid comes in. It's basically a waste of money because they don't want it. They don't want that, and it's money that could be spent on other things, right? And she just talks about how it's a very pro-life area. Like in Kenya, in their constitution, they have a proviso that life begins at conception, right? So they've de facto gotten rid of abortion. That in I think it's in Kenya, she says, like, okay, in the United States, like 40% of children are born out of wedlock, and in Nigeria, it's like 6%. And so this is a very pro-family area, even though from Western standards, it's extremely poor, right? And so they think, okay, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is they're having too many kids. And so what they're really trying to promote, though, is hedonism, right? They want very much to get the pill there, because when you do that, that's when you can control people, right? When people can't control themselves, right? Those who can't self-govern require somebody else to govern them. And so if you can't control yourself, then it's very likely that someone else is going to come in and take control of you. Go ahead.
I saw this a few weeks ago on WRAL, before like all the quarantining stuff had gotten really, really bad. There was an article saying what a tragedy it was that birth control shipments weren't making it to Africa. And they had quotes from like a few people who were like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And it was just interesting because it's being portrayed as the exact opposite of what you just said.
Of course. I mean, it's a and this is why this letter right here that Obiana Nuju wrote to Melinda Gates is really important, right? Because the Gates Foundation is right at the heart of this, right? They gave $4.6 billion to Africa, all in the form of family planning and population control. $4.6 billion. And so she writes this open letter. You can find this letter if you want. It's on the Pontifical Council for the Family's website. And it's a much longer letter than this, but look at what she says. And she's sort of saying the thing that most Africans are saying. I see this $4.6 billion buying us misery. I see it buying us unfaithful husbands. I see it buying us streets devoid of innocent chatter of children. I see it buying us disease and untimely death. I see it buying us a retirement without the tender, loving care of our children. Please, Melinda, listen to the heartfelt cry of an African woman and mercifully channel your funds to pay for what we really need. Good healthcare systems, food programs for young children, good higher education opportunities, chastity programs, support for micro business opportunities for women, fortify already established NGOs that are aimed at protecting women from sex trafficking, prostitution, forced marriages, child labor, domestic violence, sex crimes, etc. $4.6 billion can indeed be your legacy to Africa and other poor parts of the world, but let it be a legacy that leads life, love, and laughter into the world in need. Right? So why anyone in their right mind would think, okay, I have $4.6 billion to give away. So, you know what, forget the food, forget the education, forget the healthcare systems. Let's just give them contraception, because that's what they really need, right? Because they're literally dying over a lack of the pill. And now you know that again, it's at the heart of a sort of a view of the world in which you know, poor people don't need to be there, right? That's ultimately what it's saying, is that you are a nuisance to the planet because you're poor, and so in essence, we don't want you, and we just want to teach you not to want each other. And because if it was really about helping the people, it would actually meet their needs, especially the needs they perceive. And so we have to be sort of aware of this, right? Especially in an election year, where like the Mexico City policy is a good example, right? Where you know, the United States will give money to countries, attach usually the help of Planned Parenthood with those countries, in those countries. That has, under the current president, has been eliminated, but it will come back as soon as somebody from the Democratic Party is elected. And then we continue to spread that garbage around the world. And so something we really need to be aware of, and it needs to be, again, if we're going to be charitable to people, especially, you know, in Africa, then we need to be aware of this, and we need to do what we can to make it stop. All right, one last thing, and then we will be done. And that is global warming.
Save the best for last.
Yeah, I'm not going to go like deep into this, but what I want to do is, and again, I'm going to have stolen some of the stuff from Benjamin Weicker a little bit, because I think he has a sort of a balanced view of it. Again, the USCCB has written about this, and what they say is, as Catholic bishops, we make no independent judgment on the plausibility of global warming. Rather, we accept the consensus findings of so many scientists and the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a basis for continued research and prudent action, right? That's the key words, right? So saying, well, yeah, there seems to be some sort of climate change going on, no duh. And you know, we probably need to keep looking at it and then take prudent action. Scientists engaged in this research consistently acknowledge the difficulties of accurate measurement and forecasting. Responsible scientific research is always careful to recognize uncertainty and is modest in its claims. All right, so you can see this is sort of a veiled criticism of the sort of global warming agenda. Yet over the past few decades, the evidence of global climate change and the emerging scientific consensus about the human impact on this process have led many governments to reach the conclusion that they need to invest time, money, and political will to address the problem through collective international action. The virtue of prudence is paramount in addressing climate change. Right? So we already talked a little bit about this. So the whole debate sort of centers around, which Jean-Claude already mentioned, the whole carbon footprint thing. Now, CO2, sort of properly speaking, and some of you probably know way more about this than I do, is not a pollutant, right? It's
Is Rob
something,
stuttering
yeah.
for anyone else, or is that me? Okay.
Are you guys good?
Stuttering pretty bad.
All right. Tell me that sooner. Am I good now? Maybe if I get closer, it'll work.
No, it was your internet like freaking out. I don't know. It's back.
Okay. All right.
We only missed like the last 5 sentences.
Okay. Oh, well, I don't know what I said, so I'll just, anyway. So the whole debate about global warming sort of centers around carbon footprint, like John Claude said. And probably speaking, CO2 is not a pollutant, right? It's just has to be there, but has to be in the right balance, okay? And for some reason that has been sort of the target towards which sort of climate change activists are aiming, right? So there's this delicate balance. Again, remember, like God uses his fingers, right, to create the world. This delicate balance to keep the earth habitable, and so CO2 has to sort of be in this proper proportion to the other things, and it be kind of like a Goldilocks principle, I think is what they call it, where it's just everything has to be just right. And so the sun, 93 million miles away, not really hot enough to, it's too far away to really warm the earth because of our atmosphere, and so it requires these greenhouse gases to keep some of the heat in. But the problem is that there's this interconnection of things, right? Where CO2 is not the only thing that makes the earth habitable. And so we have to be careful about tinkering or focusing only on one element of it, right? Because there's all of these sort of things built in that can deal with excess CO2. And so this homeostatic mechanism that takes care of the increased CO2 but only up to a point. And then, plants are CO2 eaters. So the more plants there are, the less CO2 there is. And the more they grow, the cooler the earth will get because the solar radiation goes into photosynthesis rather than getting converted into heat. And so there's all these things sort of tied together. And again, I'm not an expert in this at all. But even these, yes.
I mean, do you think a part of and you kind of touched on a little bit with when you were saying, recycling can't be just, I guess, the solution, in capital S in that. Is it when you're trying to convert these, big, international scientific efforts down to a popular level where most people, I know I've never read the scientific literature behind global warming, is you almost have to make, I guess, this maybe whether this is the intention or not, to a certain degree, you have to make it simpler. You can't expect everybody to read the scientific literature, and so there's, intended or not, there's been kind of an effect of CO2 or forestry or XYZ is the bad guy, or this is the solution, to where recognizing a prudent action for that, or in order to understand, I guess, the underlying cause, it has to be more complex than that.
So the explanation certainly can be on simpler levels. I think the issue is more in the mindset, though, that the mindset is more that we understand this problem completely and perfectly because we're scientists. And that mindset then, and because we, sort of scientists are like the new, or the new priests, right, where everybody, or the new sages, where everybody listens to them because science said so. When in truth, they don't really understand the problem well, right? And that's why that paragraph had the word prudence in it, I think 3 times, right? Where you have to sort of recognize, well, we don't really understand this, and we could actually do more harm than good by mucking with it, right? So certainly we should put some things in place to alter the abuse of the environment, right? Now, that abuse may not be the CO2. The CO2 problem is not necessarily an abuse, right? Like if I have like 7 kids, is that really harming the environment? Like, are you really going to convince me of that? But if I have a fleet of 7 cars, might I be harming the environment? Probably, right? So the point really is, where the church sort of comes down on this, is that any measure you take has to be prudently decided, right? Because there's plenty of history of people mucking with things and not and not understanding the ramifications, right? Like I think about one of the things they did in California was they had sort of an energy crisis, right? Because their power grid is way behind, and so they decided to create all these windmills down near the California-Mexico border, and so they built these big wind farms. Well, the wind farms were there were all these raptors running into the windmills and dying, all these birds, right? And so what happened? Well, all the rodents that the raptors ate were overtaking everything, and so rats and field mice and everything were eating everything, and then so it created this new environmental crisis, where the solution may simply have been, hey, we need to use less power. Let's make it so that we're using less power. So that, again, the moral solution, right? Because when you begin to muck with something that God himself tinkered to get the balance right, you're almost always going to get it wrong because you don't understand like man's limitations, right? And it's even like Aquinas says, like only the angels like understand material creation enough that they can govern it, right? We're not governors of material creation, right? We're stewards. We're the protectors of it. We're not governors of it. And so anything we do, there's example after example of like trees are deforested, right? And yeah, that seems really bad because maybe we've lost these sort of CO2 sponges, but then erosion happens and there's mudslides and people's crops are ruined, and so it's all intimately connected, and so we can't come up with these sort of pat solutions, and we just have to sort of understand that we don't understand very well at all how it all works. And even because it's all intimately connected, even the smallest little change can set off the delicate balance. And that's the point of this whole like global warming debate, is you don't see any of the humility of going, we think this might be the case, but I wouldn't make gigantic policy decisions based upon this. I wouldn't come up with a Green New Deal because of this, right? And that's, again, when it becomes a fear tactic, right? Like since 1970, there's been unknown numbers of times. I remember, like, as a little kid, when Spock came out and said that the new ice age was upon us, right? The actor Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, said, "Okay, the ice age is coming," and now they're like, "Oh, no, the ice age isn't coming. We're gonna fry to death." And so we don't understand the problem. We still don't understand the problem. And so all the measures have to be prudently done, and we need to immediately recoil from something that is very drastic. Okay, does that make sense? And the problem is that you don't have to have, to Connor's question, you don't have to have a necessarily the scientific language to fight this, right? Like, that's for them to figure out. But I think we have to be really really suspicious when someone claims to understand exactly how something works and the exact cause of a problem. And that usually is where this issue sort of comes down. All right, other questions? Comments?
I have a question, but it can wait till after.
Well, I'm done, so.